Kevin, it's great to see you, and thank you very much for giving us at the FPA a chance to get your enlightened outlook on the world. We know each other from the board of the Asia Society, and I have a great deal of respect. I have even more respect since I now studied your background. So it's you have done a lot already in your life. It's very, very good. You originally started your career where you studied Mandarin. I remember that from talking to you. And then your career started in China. And you have learned and taught yourself a lot about the Far East. And have what is it called? They call it here in your little bio, you have you're active in regional and global foreign policy leadership. So, and I certainly have seen you at work in the Asia Society. So I totally agree with that. So you and I, and thank you for being here again. You and I will have a discussion, exchange of ideas on behalf of the FPA. It will be used in about next week, I think. But we can touch on anything, but particularly the global impact on the current COVID pandemic, what the potential consequences of that could be, and to avoid the most disastrous outcomes. And that can reach out to certain individual areas that we can touch on. And and because the COVID has brought about, and I think will bring about quite a few changes in behavior, but we don't know as of now whether it will be for the better or for the worse. And the interaction between the East and the West is absolutely crucial for the future. And so that is the broad topic. I would love to touch also a little bit on Europe, where I'm originally from, but we have just seen in the last few weeks a significant change potentially taking place there. A lot of experts on Europe had written Europe off, but with Angela Merkel's drive to change that, and we have seen the money coming out of the pockets of the German treasury, that could be interesting. So there's another subject. But, we have 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. So why don't I ask you first, Kevin, please elaborate a little bit more on that fantastic essay that you wrote for Foreign Affairs. And if you have any elaboration or if there's any changes in that you would like to touch on.
Well, thank you, Wim, and thank you to our friends at the Foreign Policy Association. It's always good to speak in FPA forums. And I bring you greetings from Australia. I'm normally resident in New York, where I head the Asia Society Policy Institute. But COVID-19 has a habit of causing us all to retreat. And so I've been back in Australia. And in fact, right now, not far from the little town that I grew up in. And it caused me to reflect the other day why I pursued a career in Chinese and then in foreign policy and the rest. I went back to visit the little cattle property that I grew up on. And I remember thinking as a kid, this is idyllic, but I don't fancy a future career in animal husbandry in Australia. And so I think that's when my imagination took me off the farm and into the world beyond Australia, and certainly to the Middle Kingdom. So let's go to the essay that I've written recently for Foreign Affairs magazine. It seeks to go to the essence, Wim, of what impact COVID-19 will have on America's power and standing in the world. What impact will it have on China's power and standing in the world? And what happens, therefore, to the global order as a consequence of those changes? And so in summary, the argument is pretty straightforward. Number one, COVID-19 has delivered a huge hit on the United States. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out that the hit on the US economy has been huge. Its further impact on the divisiveness within American politics has been huge. the flow-through impact of the crisis on the state of repair of the United States budget. That is, its fiscal condition federally has been huge. And this will therefore, objectively speaking, have a real and measurable impact on America's economic and military power in the world over time. But there's a second impact on America, and that's been reputational. The bottom line is when crises of this nature hit before in the international community, the world has always looked around for American leadership. Now, on this occasion, American leadership was missing in action, MIA. And this was a genuine shock to the international system, not just on the part of friends and allies of the United States, countries like the Netherlands, countries like Australia, but also others who are non-aligned or part of the developing country community, who have again seen America turn inwards rather than outwards. And then finally, there has been the very bad global branding, which has arisen from America's poor management of the COVID-19 crisis domestically. Put those three things together, substantively and certainly reputationally, there's been a huge hit on America's power and standing in the world. But on the question of China, it's often thought that when people make those sorts of observations, as I've just made now, that China, therefore, is the net winner from all of this. And that's where I challenge that thesis as well. China has also been significantly damaged by the COVID-19 crisis. China now is experiencing the worst economic growth rates in half a century. China has not had economic non-growth of the type we see now since the end of the Cultural Revolution. And given that so much of the Chinese political social contract between the Communist Party and its people has rested on an assumption that living standards would continue to rise, there will be new and better jobs available for the Chinese people across China's vast country, that contract, therefore, is in grave danger of being breached because of this massive economic hit and significant public health hit as well. And of course, all that comes again into stark and continuing focus with recent reports of the re-emergence of a second wave effect in Beijing itself. But then secondly, and to follow the logic of my thoughts just before on the United States, China has also suffered a huge reputational hit. Whereas the world has been captivated by China's so-called wolf warrior diplomacy as it doubles down against its critics, and as China has sought to overcome any damage to its reputation as being the originator of the COVID-19 virus through its COVID-19 aid diplomacy, that is PPE, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and other health-related assistance to various countries around the world, both developed and developing. The bottom line is, in the court of international public opinion, is there has been a huge hit on China's global standing because the failure of its system domestically to contain this virus in the first critical several weeks, and genuine questions about the extent to which the Chinese system performed effectively or not in that critical period, particularly given the deep learnings which were supposed to be delivered to China as a consequence of the SARS experience of 2003. So what's the net impact of all the above? Both these great powers have taken a huge hit in terms of their objective economic strength. Both these countries have taken a huge hit in terms of their international reputational damage. And let me just add one other factor as well. Both these countries have also seen the emergence of new political debates domestically, big ones in terms of the effectiveness of their own political leadership. So I conclude these thoughts, Wim, simply by saying, given those realities, what's it mean for the global order, where most of the rest of the world's population actually live? If you don't happen to be 1.4 billion Chinese or 350 million Americans, and given there are 7 billion people on the planet spread across another 190 nation states, other than the 2 we've just mentioned, then how then will the order unfold in the future? My grave concern, and we'll take this further in our conversation, is that with no one any longer in the driving seat, that the institutions of global governance, whether it's through the United Nations system or the Bretton Woods institutions, progressively begin to fall into disrepair because we no longer have, as I said, a person or persons in the global driving seat, given that's been our assumption by and large since 1945. I conclude with this. Global orders in history have been constructed essentially on two premises. One, the actual balance of power between the great powers and with the presence or absence of an equilibrium. And two, the institutions of, shall we say, international governance constructed on the basis of that power equilibrium. The power equilibrium now is destabilized by these COVID-19 factors, in addition to the pre-existing shift in the distribution of power between China and the United States over the last 10 to 20 years. But when you look closely at the institutions of global governance, Wim, these too are also beginning to, as it were, shake in their foundations. And this requires a new level of global activism on the part of middle powers in Europe and in Asia in order to re-stabilize the institutions of global governance until the great powers achieve a new equilibrium between themselves. Back to you, Wim.
This is obviously extraordinarily complicated. So the simplicity that, for instance, people in the United States view China is sometimes very, very frightening, and because the person you don't know, you're definitely not usually inclined to like that person. We are also faced with a typical situation where China is growing faster than the United has a history in the last decade of growing faster than in the United States. And it's been traditionally since World War II that we are indeed the leader, quote unquote, in the world, and particularly helping, sometimes not positively, but we have been viewed like the leader and the solver of problems. Now, we feel that we're being, as a country, a very large country that is about to surpass us. And that has created a lot of tension. And it's like in a race, when you're in an athletic race, if you're ahead, and you see that you are 10 feet ahead, you are quietly running and you still have focus on being as smooth as possible. However, if you hear the sound of somebody catching up to you, you have a tendency to tense up. And that has been happening here in the United States over the last few years. And we see things developing in China that are exaggerated or totally misunderstood. You obviously have traveled widely in China. I have been there at least 15 times myself. And so now we are in a COVID situation where the economy in the world is, of course, very negatively impacted. In case of economic setbacks, people mindset changes as well. And when you have a country that says America first, that doesn't leave much room for negotiations, because that means that whoever you talk to is going to be on the short end of the stick. So what in your mind is required in order to smooth this out once COVID is behind us, and hopefully it will be behind us in the first part of next year? What kind of approach would you advocate? And I'm not talking about the approach at the surface, being nice to each other. What fundamental changes would have to happen to see that we can start working together? Because I am, au fond, I am a globalist myself. I think I was a teenager when Europe started the European Union, and I was then already as a teenager totally in favor of it. Because I think that is the only direction we can go, and hopefully we will see that happening again. But it does require that there is at least a stable economic background before people change their mind. before people change their minds. And so what climate do you see, or what would have to au fond change for that to gradually develop after this is behind us?
Well, thank you, Wim, for the observation and the analogy. I'm still thinking about the analogy of two athletes competing on the running track. You seem to have used that analogy, Wim, as someone who used to be an athlete himself, because you described yourself at the front and someone coming up the rear. As someone who's always been a non-athlete, I've always been in the rear, so and never quite closing the gap with the person in front of me. But let's apply all that to the relationship between China and the United States. Number one, none of us can push the realities of geopolitics to one side. They exist, and by their very nature, they are by and large competitive, and they are a reflection of both objective power and how power is perceived. Two, if you look at the analogy you just referred to, Wim, which is the evolution of the European project from the coal and steel agreement of 1954 through to the early evolution of Benelux between Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg, and then originally the founding seven of what was then the European Community, and where we've now evolved the European Project too. The really important thing to remember about that entire period was the vision of the founding fathers, and they were all fathers in Europe, what it was, where it had come from, which was 500 years of you Europeans blowing each other's brains out, and finally working out this was not a good idea for the future. And then on top of that, there was also an underlying recognition that geopolitical stability was sustained between the two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and that Europe was in an active balance of power itself through NATO against the then Soviet Union as Warsaw Pact allies. And so you had this coexistence of a grand unifying project, which was the European project on the one hand, but underneath it all, there was a deep and enduring geopolitical reality, which nonetheless stabilized over time, and particularly in the period of détente from the late 1960s, after the world had a near-death experience in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963. So applying all that logic to the United States and China, and for where the world evolves to now in either an age of continued globalization, or as some analysts would say, a world which is now past peak globalization and returning to various forms of nationalism and protectionism. My argument would be, Wim, that the number one condition is to restabilize the great power relationships as they currently exist. I don't think you have to be a foreign policy specialist to work out that the US-China relationship is currently in its worst state of bilateral disrepair for the last 50 years. It's 50 years next year when a young Henry Kissinger undertook his secret diplomatic mission to Beijing. And having spoken to Henry about this in recent times myself, he finds it hard, and so do I, as someone who's been professionally looking at this relationship for the last 35 years, for them to identify a worse period across the board, militarily, economically, technologically, multilaterally, and bilaterally in the history of the US-China relationship. So given its intrinsically competitive nature, and given that we do have a narrowing of the power disparities between China and the United States, militarily, economically, and technologically, how then should this competition be managed in the future? And there are two options. One is a return to the law of the jungle, no rules, may the best man win, all's fair in love and war, and that is enormously destabilizing, not just for the two countries themselves, but for the rest of the international system, and for those of us who are friends or allies of one side or the other or both countries. The second is to manage that competition. And that's certainly the conceptual approach that I have long favoured. And it is not a piece of idealism to suggest that a superpower rivalry or great power rivalry, active great power competition, cannot nonetheless be simultaneously managed within certain parameters. And that, after all, is what by and large happened in the post-Détente period of the US-Soviet relationship back then. There were certain red lines which would not be crossed, particularly those which involved any risk of a nuclear exchange between the two great powers, or head-on-head military confrontation conventionally between US and Soviet forces for fear of where that would escalate to. Now, in my judgment, given we have so many tripwires for US-Chinese military confrontation over Taiwan, over the South China Sea and over the East China Sea, that is precisely the direction where I think there is a deep strategic interest on both sides to establish mutually recognizable red lines, which are then observed while the rest of the strategic competition, militarily, economically, and technologically, unfolds. That, I think, is the wise way forward.
Okay, thank you. Because there are many a pitfall. We have, in effect, what is happening now with the economy, the world economy, taking quite a hit. We have a situation where fossil fuel, is very cheap, but that is also is beneficial, but it is also could lead to us taking it for granted that will be the case, and not necessarily focus on the next 50 years how we can get much cheaper energy. And politically, I'm tying that in with the situation for the producers, because Russia is a one commodity country. It's a very high percentage of their income comes from fuel. The Middle East, don't need to tell you how much is, and so those are potentially very explosive areas that could upset the balance that we are trying to build. We have to build it. You have been a politician, you've been a leader of a party and prime minister, so you know how to work together to get things done. But if certain parts of the world really get a significant setback, which seems highly likely, that could, so in current climate, could spill over very easily. And I have been surprised. I've lived here a long time. I've been surprised how little Americans know about China, really about China. China, that's why even amongst the Democrats right now, is not particularly popular. And the less we know of each other, the worse it is going to get in case the economics continue weak. In this context, and not necessarily to be pursued at this particular moment, but we now have governments that follow a very simple rule of nothing can fail. So in the olden days, under Greenspan, that was called the Greenspan put. If the moment things started to slow down, the governments and the Federal Reserve and the central banks threw money at it. And then we perk up again, and then 8 years later, we had 8 years later, we had the same thing. So we have, as a people, although we have improved economically over the world, not everything is bad, but we're also, in the West in particular, taking a lot of things for granted. And we also assume that it automatically will be resolved by the central governments and the central banks. And we don't throw any more billions of it. Everett Dixon used to say, billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some serious money. now it's $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, and you're talking about serious money. And that money eventually is going to be activated. And that could lead again to a completely different kind of atmosphere where envy could start again, and you have some major tensions in the world about that situation. How do you see all of this? I have embedded in this quite a few questions. You can't answer all of them, but how do you see this developing in the next few years?
If we apply the basic logic of the current crisis, which is simultaneously a public health crisis and a crisis in the real economy induced by comprehensive lockdowns in most, if not all, economies, then two big, in my judgment, economic questions emerge. The first is, at the end of the day, debt, public or private, has to land on somebody's balance sheet. It cannot be simply wished away, although there may be some exercises of significant debt forgiveness and debt rescheduling when it comes to emerging markets. But when we're speaking of multi-trillion-dollar debt levels across both developed and developing economies, if and when the public health environment returns to normal, that debt has to land somewhere, either in financial institutions, either on corporate balance sheets, either on personal balance sheets, or on public balance sheets. And the challenge for national governments and international systems with the International Monetary Fund is how is that then stabilized, which in a manner which doesn't cause the system then to financially implode. Fortunately, Wim, as you know, there are highly intelligent individuals working on these questions as we speak in the IMF, in the Financial Stability Board, and in the Basel Committee, working their way through. But it is, as it were, the debt time bomb which has been planted within the global system, and a time bomb which needs to be diffused by intelligent and sensitive hands in the months and immediate year or so ahead. The second economic consequence is the one you directly referred to, Wim, which is what happens with investable capital, given that many people have exited equities markets, not as many of us thought originally. Many people have gone to cash, and many people are sitting on secure assets. What happens with this enormous pool of investable capital as the economy begins to return to normal, both nationally and globally? That remains an open question. And of course, in free markets, that capital will go wherever it chooses. But on one key question, I would strongly suggest that governments have a particular regulatory role in encouraging capital to go in a particular direction. And that is the whole new wave of futures which exists for the planet in every conceivable category of renewable energy, innovation and research. This is not just a classical conversation about the world turning solar. It's not just a conversation dealing with wind power in conventional terms, nor is it simply a conventional conversation about energy efficiency. It's about paradigm changing ways in which we challenge the way in which we produce energy and the way in which we conserve energy. And if through regulatory environments, both globally and nationally, we can encourage private capital to fire up the energy infrastructure of the 21st century, then this will be a crisis which indeed has not been wasted. My final point about the economic and financial questions which you raised, Wim, is to go to, again, how that unfolds in the US-China relationship most specifically. At present, there is a lot of loose language about we are already in a new Cold War. Well, no. Those of us old enough to remember the last Cold War know what it was like. And the characteristics of the US-Soviet relationship are not those of the US-China relationship, even in these current appalling conditions. And the key difference is that there is a $5 trillion a year annual business between China and the United States in financial markets, equities, debt, markets, corporate, as well as public, US treasuries, etc. This sort of enmeshed financial relationship between China and the United States, which still exists, did not exist in the days of the US and the Soviet Union. So when people talk about blandly and blithely that, oh, well, we're in a new Cold War, well, actually, this is one huge reason why we are not. But it then brings us back to the core question for the future. In the equally loose conversation about economic decoupling between China and the United States, in trade, in global supply chains, in technology most particularly, but also increasingly in talent markets and potentially in regulatory stance. The last remaining bastion, and it's a big bastion, providing the glue for the US-China relationship is finance. And will this bastion hold or will it be unraveled? There are early signs of low-level unraveling. The new rules we've seen promulgated for the New York Stock Exchange in terms of future Chinese corporate listings. Secondly, the directives now being provided to US public pension funds not to invest in Chinese equities. If this develops its own momentum and China proceeds in a retaliatory direction itself, then that is the surefire way to end up in Cold War 2.0. Right now, I characterize it as Cold War 1.5, and the missing bit is finance.
In this context, I'd like to follow it up a little bit more in detail. Right now, the United States has come up, and I talk to many people all over the world, and the comments are all somewhat along the same line. The United States has come across as, under current leadership, as pretty chaotic, putting it mildly, and showing signs of weakness from within. I've always believed that the United States doesn't have to fear much on the outside because it's an island between two huge oceans. If there was ever anything in the future that would undermine the United States, it would be from within. And right now, like you briefly touched on, it's a little crumbling at the edges. Now, the world is basically a jungle, and the strong always smell out the weak or the weakening. What would you recommend to the respective three powers? Let's put it this way. Let's be upbeat. China, United States, and Europe. What conversations should be taking place to avoid where one starts to take advantage of the other because that country or nation came across as weak? That has meant in Europe, that's how many wars started. You say Europe had 500 years of blowing each other's brains out. That was exactly about that, because any country at any one moment took advantage of the population. We, even in this country, have for the last 50 years, the percentage of income of GDP that goes to labor is steadily declining already for that long. In Europe, that eventually led to a revolution or weakening from within. What, in your recommendation, would you say if some leader in Europe, let's say my favorite leader is Angela Merkel and Xi Jinping, and the future leader of the United States, what if you were asked what attitude should you have? how to avoid that one of us falls into the trap and tries to take advantage when a country is weak, take advantage of that. Because to some extent, Kevin, that has already been taking place. How do you see that?
Well, as you're right, Wim, it's important to remember where we've all come from as an international community. If we look at the long sweep of the history of international relations, order is the exception, chaos is the norm. Look at the last 500 years. Order, that is a set of rules which preserve international peace and which by and large provide levels of international governance, has really been an innovation of the last 3/4 of a century. As for the rest of the 500 years, we can have a technical debate about the League of Nations in the interwar period. We can have a technical debate about the Congress of Vienna. We can have a technical debate about, the history of the Habsburg Empire. And we can have a technical debate about the broader experience of the Holy Roman Empire. But by and large, order as we would currently understand it is a relatively recent and relatively short in time experience. And therefore, when we look at the alternative, which is chaos, it is governed by the law of the jungle and the survival of the fittest. It's what I would describe as international Darwinism. And frankly, it's why we ended up in so many of the conflicts of the past. And secondly, just to take a non-European perspective of this and a non-Western perspective, pre-existing concepts of order in the rest of the world were not in fact delivered by centuries of European colonialism. In fact, if you're on the receiving end of that colonialism in Africa and Asia and in Latin America, there was no order, there was simply exploitation. So the question is, given where we've got to in the post-45 world, with the United Nations, a decolonization effort, producing 192 member states now. There were only 50 at the time the United Nations Charter was signed in 1945. And rules of international law on armed conflict and the prevention of armed conflict, the institution of the UN Security Council, as well as the other institutions of global political and economic and security governance and now environmental governance. My argument is, these are massive civilizational achievements, given where we've all come from and the various laws of the jungle, either in the West or in the emerging world and in emerging markets and in developing countries, where we've been in the past. That, I think, is the piece of historical wisdom which our current generation of leaders need to have. Second, for the future, therefore, a necessary first step, as we discussed earlier in this discussion, is to stabilize the great power relationship between China and the United States along what I would describe as classical détente lines. That is a mutual understanding of each other's red lines, so that we do not simply, as it were, degenerate into crisis, escalation, conflict, and war, given there are so many unresolved territorial disputes in East Asia alone, all of which are at the moment erupting, including those on the Sino-Indian border. So providing that level of geopolitical stability through effective détente and the redefinition of mutually acceptable red lines and a mechanism to police those is essential to stabilize the order. But there's a third element as well. And that's what I describe as the challenge which we all face, and where Europe, in my judgment, has a particular role to play in triaging the international system while the great powers sort themselves out. Like yourself, I'm a fan of Angela Merkel, and she has provided strong leadership in Germany. She's often criticized in Europe for either being too strong or too weak. Must be difficult being a post-45 Chancellor of Germany, given the history. But Angela Merkel also comes from having lived on the edge in former East Germany and knowing what it was like living on the edge of order and chaos in that whole period from the establishment of East Germany and 40 years later, the collapse of the Iron Curtain. Europe, therefore, mindful of its past and aided by having effective political leaders like Angela Merkel, needs to lead in the triaging of the international system. And what do I mean by that? And I'll conclude on this point because I know our time for conversation is drawing to a close. What I mean is, when it comes to the critical institutions of global governance, like the World Trade Organization, like currently our discussion about the World Health Organization, as well as other institutions of global governance, whether it's at one end the Human Rights Council, at the other end the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or at another end itself the continued functioning of the UN Security Council and the active operation of the G20. Europe and like-minded countries, let's call it the democracies of Asia and Europe and of North America, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, your own country, the Netherlands, Sweden, in Asia, the democracies of the Republic of Korea, of Japan, of Australia, of India, and in North America, Canada, Mexico. These countries having a combined project among themselves, what I've called in previous conversations, either the Magnificent Seven, the Multilateral Seven, or the M7, combining their diplomatic resources, their financial capabilities, and their collective power in the international system to support the critical institutions of global governance, to enable them to work at a minimum and effective level until we have the re-establishment of geopolitical equilibrium between the great powers. And that's where Europe, in my argument, Wim, has a central role to play, including countries like my own country, Australia, as well.
Thanks you, Kevin. I wholeheartedly agree with that latter statement because you touched on, stepping out of some of these world organizations. If you're on the outside, it's much more difficult to change things than when you're part of the inside. And I'm a strong believer that you're better off on the inside because then you can work within. And if you're a good politician like Kevin Rudd, he was a very smooth operator and did some marvelous job in Australia. So we have more people like you actually in leadership position compared to some of the dictators that are currently seem to be growing like weed. Because if you pull yourself out of an international organization and you're no longer part of it, just like the United States pulled itself out of the Far Eastern Trade Organization, that leaves a gap, and the world nature doesn't like vacuums. It's going to be filled up, and so be part of that is absolutely crucial. And for instance, even Germany has been vilified for being so concentrated on the almighty Deutschmark as it used to be, and then and critical of their neighbors that were not as disciplined as they were, and it took a long time, but lo and behold, now we are at the point where Angela Merkel, from East Germany no less, came up with this and said, well, wait a minute, she called it a different name, very clever, but now there is a certain peace has returned to Europe, and other European countries have also seen the struggles that England goes through, the Brexit. So if even Germany can subsequently, after at least 20 years, come to grips with the fact that they are part of Europe and cement the relationships amongst the European countries, I think then there is hope. But, and then for Europe it's more difficult because they're different cultures. The United States has, although we were all immigrants at one stage, except the local Indians. It was easier to assimilate the situation here compared to Europe and Asia as well. But it is, in the end, is the only way to go. And maybe it requires, after this is behind us, and we have here a leader that does not believe in it, which makes it very, very difficult for the rest of the world, because we are still very much a world power. So we have to have a leader here that is willing to think along those lines and working together and join together and do touch on things like climate issues, which are absolutely crucial, that can only be resolved on an international basis. The Dutch have been accused of socialist, by the way, and that is, to me, has a negative implication here in the United States, because here socialism is associated too closely with communism. But the Dutch have given it a different name. And the Dutch have called it social mindedness, because they have a common enemy called the ocean. And they can only work together, the different parts of Holland can work together to keep the ocean on the other side of the dikes. And social mindedness is taking care and helping your neighbors. That mindset, how does one instill that? And it takes a long time to instill that, but that's the kind of mindedness that you need to make the world kind of more willing to get along and help each other. We do that already, but still clearly not enough, because with the poverty that we still have, it's still, and the antagonistic attitude that we are currently faced with, which is very, very difficult, straining, tension-filled on every population. I mean, there's, no matter who you talk to, whether you talk to anybody in Europe, the tension that is on the outside world, it has an impact on the economy. And since it is psychological, that means that we are going to be less productive as long as that tension prevails. So that was, we have run out of time to tell the truth, Kevin. If you have a quick answer, to what I just said, or an additional observation.
Well, I'll just conclude our conversation with this, Wim. The Chinese have a term about the way we think. The term is 思维, or a way of thinking. And of course, the thing about 思维, or ways of thinking, is that they're so deeply embedded in our, let's call it, social and political consciousness, that we're usually unaware of them. And often the most deeply embedded 思维, or ways of thinking, are national, and sometimes at their worst expression are nationalist. One country defining itself purely in terms of its opposition or hostility towards another. There is, of course, an alternative 思维, and the alternative way of thinking is to see the world as the global village, to see the world as the global commons, and to see us as global citizens. That is not to say that nation states could or should disappear, but it is to say that in terms of our way of thinking about each other, that rather than the zero-sum game of I win, you lose, my identity is good and your national identity is bad, even in the fascinating history of the Netherlands and the history of the Dutch revolt against the Spanish Empire, this sort of intensity of local identity of one set of Dutch provinces against another. And so it is replicated around the world. But in fact, there is a different way of thinking, which is to see us as citizens of one planet. Now, I'm not a utopian idealist. I don't believe that if we think differently, that the world will automatically change.
Sure.
Geopolitics and economic competition continue. But the challenge for the way we think as to whether that competition occurs within the framework of our mutual understanding that we are operating within the global commons, with global responsibilities to sustain the commons environmentally, socially, and with reasonable levels of equity, or whether it is the return to the absolute Darwinian brutality of the law of the jungle. Now, I would hope that if civilization has anything to say for itself and its various traditions, either in Confucianism or Islam or in Judeo-Christianity or in other philosophical bodies of thought, that we are not simply condemned by our fate in the stars to live in a state of semi-permanent hatred of one towards the other. But there is a sufficient commonality in our common interest to cause us to change our thinking about that. And with the evolution of time, an even deeper consciousness that in fact we have much more in common with each other than we have differences. That's a project worth pursuing, and frankly in the Asia Society, where I'm president of the Policy Institute, it's one of our missions in terms of long-term ways of thinking about international relations, rather than simply dealing exclusively with the day-to-day grind and frankly pessimism of geopolitics, economic competition, and environmental desperation. So thank you, Wim, for having me to speak with your friends and colleagues in the Foreign Policy Association. I wish you well, and I wish everyone good health in what is a very difficult season for all of our friends around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's much appreciated. And I hope we see each other again when you show up in New York City, and we'll have a chance to get together then. And so thank you very, very much.
All the best, Wim.